Backstage, we had a coin toss to decide who would go first. And the result of that is that Dr. Noam Chomsky will be our first speaker. Dr. Chomsky.
Mr. Herman didn't say that he got the wish of a lifetime by tossing a coin. He said, felt that he was really out there on the football field. When we investigate the foreign policy of any state, we find, first of all, an official doctrine that attributes to state policy honorable intent, though occasional failure, due primarily to the machinations of evil enemies. Thus, Soviet propaganda proclaims the commitment of the Soviet Union to peace, democracy, and human rights, describes the Soviet posture as defensive, and identifies U.S. imperialism as the prime source of disorder and suffering throughout the world. Official U.S. doctrine is the mirror image, and the pattern is far more pervasive, if not universal. If we investigate further, we regularly discover that official doctrine is quite inconsistent with the historical and documentary record. In our case, we are fortunate to have access to a rich documentary record for earlier years. We discover, not surprisingly, that it conforms to the pattern of evolving events and is entirely inconsistent with widely proclaimed doctrine. Now, I cannot hope to establish these conclusions in a few minutes. Rather, I'll try to sketch the main outlines of what I believe you will discover if you explore the record on your own, as I very much hope you will. I'll focus on Central America and the Middle East in the post-World War II period, but the record for earlier years and other regions is much the same. The United States emerged from World War II in a position of global power with few, if any, historical precedents, and U.S. elites were well aware of the fact. Through the 1940s, they carried out sophisticated geopolitical planning, which is on record, to fashion a global order that would be responsive to their interests. During the war, top State Department planners carried out extensive studies with the Council on Foreign Relations to develop the general outlines of global policy, later applied to particular regions. They developed the concept of what they called the Grand Area. The Grand Area was to be a region subordinated to the needs of the American economy, in a framework of liberal internationalism in which it was plausibly assumed U.S. interests would dominate. The Grand Area was outlined in detail. It was to include, at a minimum, the Far East, the Western Hemisphere, and the former British Empire, including the energy reserves of the Middle East, which the State Department described as, I'm quoting, a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history, the richest economic prize in the world in the field of foreign investment, referring to Saudi Arabia. At a maximum, the Grand Area should become a world system under U.S. control. Now, the Grand Area had a structure. The industrial powers were to be reconstituted, but under U.S. control and in a manner acceptable to the United States, a commitment with many significant consequences. It was understood that Europe and Japan required a hinterland. State Department studies, now declassified, explain that the Third World was to fulfill its function as a source of raw materials and markets for the industrial capitalist powers and was to be exploited, as they put it, for their reconstruction. With regard to Latin America, George Kennan, who was one of the most influential of post-war planners, explained in internal discussion that a prime concern is the protection of our raw materials. More generally, he observed that we have 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6% of its population, and we must maintain this disparity to the extent possible by force if necessary, putting aside vague and idealistic slogans such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization, preferring police states if needed over democracies that might be too liberal and too indulgent to what were called communists. The latter term has lost any substantive meaning in U.S. political rhetoric, referring simply to anyone who stands in our way. These are all quotes. These are all quotes, incidentally. The declassified documents on U.S. foreign policy in Latin America apply these ideas in detail. They explain that the primary threat we face in Latin America, I'm continuing to quote, is the trend toward nationalistic regimes that respond to popular demand for improvement in low living standards and production for domestic needs. Now that's unacceptable because the United States is committed to, quote, encouraging a climate conducive to private investment, in particular, guarantees for opportunity to earn, and in the case of foreign capital, to repatriate a reasonable return. We must therefore oppose what is regularly called ultranationalism in secret documents. That means efforts to pursue domestic needs. We must foster export-oriented production in the interest of U.S. investors. Now, it is recognized that such programs have very little appeal to the Latin American public, so the conclusion is the natural one. We must therefore gain control over the military, which can in turn control domestic opposition and overthrow civilian governments if necessary. We must also act to overcome the excessive liberalism of the Latin American countries. These ideas are outlined in the high-level documents and were applied in practice in Latin America as elsewhere. If some group or country succumbs to ultranationalism, it must be disciplined by the local security forces under U.S. control if possible, or by direct U.S. subversion or aggression. And the modern history of Latin America is to a significant extent an application of these doctrines. So a brief experiment in capitalist democracy in Guatemala was terminated in 1954 by a CIA coup installing a murderous terror state that has been maintained by regular U.S. intervention to block elections and to conduct regular repression and massacre. These operations reached a peak in the past decade with perhaps 100,000 people killed and innumerable others tortured, maimed, and starved, all of this enthusiastically supported by the Reagan administration. Meanwhile, Honduras was turned into a U.S. military base with increasing human rights violations, reaching several assassinations a week last year, and hundreds of thousands of peasants starving to death while the country exports snow peas and beef for U.S. markets, that being a typical consequence of the U.S. imposed aid and development model. In El Salvador, in the late 1970s, there was a proliferation of popular organizations, largely church-based, that threatened to lay the basis for meaningful democracy and social reforms. The Archbishop pleaded with the United States government not to send aid to the junta because it would be used, he said, to destroy the people's organizations fighting to defend their fundamental human rights. The security forces backed by the United States overcame the threat of democracy and social reform by terror and slaughter, murdering the political opposition, assassinating the Archbishop, physically destroying the independent media, invading and largely destroying the university, slaughtering tens of thousands of peasants, union leaders, and others, killing priests and nuns and intellectuals or driving them out of the country, to which they still cannot return for fear of torture and assassination. When the population was considered to be sufficiently traumatized, a so-called election was held in an atmosphere of terror and despair, macabre rumor and grisly reality, in the words of the British Parliamentary Human Rights Group that observed it. I should add that it's a staple of independent scholarship that, I quote now, while paying lip service to the encouragement of representative democracy in Latin America, the United States has a strong interest in just the reverse, apart from formal elections that are often farcical, and that the alleged U.S. concern for democracy when proper conditions have been established by repression, violence, or simply control of resources, that is only a tactical device to ensure the dominance of, quote, private capitalistic enterprise linked to the United States. I'm quoting from